Okay, hi everyone. This is the part two of my transportation lectures for this week. And again, I'm pretty closely following the chapter that we're reading for this week. And the chapter concludes by looking at some of the social costs of an automobile-based transportation system, such as Los Angeles and, in fact, most cities in the United States, and then discusses briefly some possible solutions. So if we look at some of the social costs, there have been a number of studies that have been done that have attempted to uh, measure the different hours, amount of time that people spend sitting in their cars. And not surprisingly, Los Angeles typically comes out on top in terms of annual hours of delay per traveler. And so if you look at the left of this bar graph here, the red bar is 1982, and the silver bar is for the year 2005. And so in 1982, um, uh, the average person spent something like 45 hours sitting in their car in traffic during the year. And that's a lot if you consider that that's the average. If you take the top half of folks, it's probably much greater. By 2005, that increased to approximately 71 hours, a huge increase. So some of the other cities that also had a high number of annual hours of delay per traveler due to traffic congestion were San Francisco, Atlanta, then Dallas, New York, and Chicago. I was surprised that San Francisco was up there because they have a pretty good public transit system. Although for those that do drive, the traffic can be pretty heavy. You can see a huge increase there between 1982 and 2005 for San Francisco. And then you can also see the increase for the other cities as well. So traffic congestion has been getting much worse in recent decades. Some studies also have attempted to estimate how much it costs to society to have people sitting in traffic. And these kinds of studies are typically based on an estimation of how much people get paid in their work, say on an hourly basis, how much it costs for them in terms of gasoline and wear and tear on the car when they're sitting in traffic. And those are usually the main cost factors that are brought into the equation. But anyway, again, we can see here Los Angeles comes in second place. This is for 2011. And this particular study estimated that it cost, traffic congestion in 2011 cost the public or society just over $10 billion. You add up all of that time. And then you can see how the other cities kind of fared. Uh, New York was actually the highest, and Chicago, Dallas, Miami, Atlanta, and so on. So New York also has a pretty good public transit system, although this is accounting for those who are actually using their cars and who rely on their cars. What are the cost estimates for that group? This graph shows the amount of gasoline consumption per capita for various countries for 2010. And without kind of getting into the numbers too much, just suffice it to say that the United States is the leader in gasoline consumption when compared with these countries: Canada, the United Kingdom, Germany, Europe, France, and so on. And in fact, the United States consumes considerably more gasoline than those countries. And the United States has a larger population and more people drive, of course. And so that accounts for those higher numbers. So there's an argument that the author makes in the chapter that there is a great need for more public transportation. And we would probably all agree to some degree that we do need more light rail and subway and all other alternative means of getting around than the automobile. Probably the debate would be, how much public transportation do we need? The authors argue there's a great need for the transportation, and that it's not possible, at least in the United States, without intervention from government. That the market left alone is not going to provide the needed public transportation that cities and our communities need. Now, this chart is from chapter 6 of our reading, and it shows the percent of daily trips by public transportation, bicycle, and foot. So if we look at the bar graph for the United States, for example, on the far left, the yellow part is for walking, the blue part is for bicycles, and the black part is public transportation. So for those who make daily trips, and I think this is the public trips, it could be to work or to the store or things of that nature. The graph underscores the fact that fewer people in the United States rely on public transportation, walking and cycling, compared with many other countries. Let's take the extreme here on the far right-hand side is the Netherlands, where you can see that the majority of people either get to work or to other places they're going by walking, bicycling, or through public transportation. So, some would argue this is what the United States should aim for. And again, that's kind of subjective. There are, of course, those out there who continue to argue that we should, for the most part, leave it to the market. And if people prefer to drive, then let's continue with the automobile, because the consumer is king in that market model that we discussed earlier. So we go back to this picture that I started off this lecture with, the first lecture, and it is of Los Angeles, and a picture tells 1,000 words. This is the kind of city that we live in. That's highly dependent upon freeways, roads, and the automobile. Now, one of the problems that this has led to is that things are very spread out in Los Angeles. And this is true of a lot of other cities. We have designed our cities around freeways and, importantly, around the objective of building residential developments that spread to outlying areas of the city. So those two things have really gone hand in hand, the building of freeways and roads and residential communities. One of the problems with this spread out kind of development is that it's very difficult to integrate a public transit system into a city that's so spread out. And this is really one of a huge challenge that Los Angeles has faced now. In the last few decades, there has been more public transit built into the city, things like the Gold Line, the Underground Red Line, the Green Line. There's a number of different above ground light rail systems now. But again, it's some cities in the Netherlands and other cities in Europe are much denser. So people are living much closer together. And in addition, where people work and where they shop and where they recreate and so on are located in much denser cities. So it's more viable to ride your bike to work, for example, or to take public transportation to work. So this is a real problem. It's a real challenge. Now, as a general rule, as it says here on this PowerPoint, efficient public transit systems require population densities of at least 2,000 people per square mile. And that's a relatively dense city. So that's a real challenge. Now there's some great trade-offs. There are some great positive externalities. There's some great benefits, however you want to put it, to having more public transportation. And one of those, of course, is reduced air pollution, including greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide. The automobile is the main source of carbon dioxide emissions. And so the benefits to society of reducing greenhouse gases would be tremendous if more people are taking public transportation. There would be greater efficiency in labor markets. When I say labor markets, that refers to people going to work and getting jobs and employers hiring people. So if you can make it easier for people to get to work, it would be a great benefit to society. This is especially important for poor individuals who may not be able to afford a car, and this would enable them to get to work. There's been a number of studies that have shown that people that live in poor communities are at a significant disadvantage into finding jobs, because our jobs, the availability of jobs, of employment, is for many places, many people within the city, located far away. So you basically have to have a car. And if you don't have a car, it's going to make it that much more difficult. So by having more public transportation, it can, studies have shown, potentially reduce poverty and really alleviate some of the hardships experienced by the poor. It would also be a benefit to employers. Employers often complain that it's difficult to find a workforce, and it's when people have to commute a long way, it creates problems with people. There would also be considerable health benefits to having more public transportation. For example, you would get great reductions in the number of children and adults, children especially, who contract asthma and a variety of other illnesses, most of them respiratory related illnesses. And you think about the reduced costs. You have fewer people going to the hospital, people are spending less money on medical care, and so on and so forth. You would have a reduction in the rate of obesity among people in the community. Studies have shown that as we have become more and more car dependent, and it's just difficult or impossible to get around by walking or bicycle, there are higher rates of obesity. Those cities, especially in some of the European countries where it's practical to get around by bicycle and walking and so on, rates of obesity are considerably lower. And then finally, for those who do have to drive, there would be less congestion. You wouldn't have cars, or you would have fewer cars idling in traffic and emitting greenhouse gases. You would have the costs in terms of gasoline and lost time at work and so on and so forth would decline, because it would be easier for those people who have to have a car to get around. So you can see that there's a myriad of benefits to society through having more public transportation. The authors talk a little bit about some solutions to getting to that point. And one thing they emphasize and propose is to increase taxes on gasoline. Now, I myself, don't want to pay more for gas than I'm already paying. But I think the point here is that if you look at some other countries of the world, the costs of gasoline are much higher because it's taxed at a very high rate. And this discourages people from driving cars. Now, I think you could argue that in some of these countries, it makes sense because there is an easy alternative available for most people to get around by public transportation. Unfortunately, that alternative does not exist for most people in cities in the United States. But nonetheless, it's something to think about. It's food for thought. There is, I think, a more practical effort underway right now in Los Angeles and other cities to encourage development to be more dense. In other words, to do things through changes in zoning laws and land use. We'll talk a little bit about land use and zoning later, but you can do things to encourage higher density. And that makes it a little more practical to have public transportation. So you have people living closer to work, living closer to grocery stores, and that kind of thing. Now, some people don't like the idea of density because that involves typically more apartments and condominiums and townhouses. You don't have a large single-family residential community that many people are accustomed to and expect. But I think if population continues to grow in Los Angeles, as it has in the last few decades, really the city has no choice but to become more dense and to see development kind of go upwards instead of outwards. And if you're going to do that, it makes sense to try and integrate public transportation around higher density developments. So that was all we have for today. There's a lot more to cover in the field of transportation. This is just one chapter as part of a class. But we actually have, I thought I would mention, a professor in our department who teaches a couple classes just on transportation. So it's definitely something that you can dedicate a few classes to. Okay, so we'll see you later. That ends this second part of this week's lecture.